Good afternoon and good evening, everybody. I'm super excited to share today's talk on bias in medical education. I am super thrilled to do this with several stellar faculty and residents across the country. And I also want to take a moment to just acknowledge the sponsors for tonight's event, the ADIAM, Equity and Inclusion Committee, AWEM, CDEM, and RAMS. So first, we're going to talk about the Leaky Pipeline. My name is Alvarez. I'm the Director of Wellbeing at Stanford Emergency Medicine. I want to just highlight that the face of America is changing. The Institute of Medicine found that a lack of underrepresented in medicine physicians contribute to the overall health disparities that's existing. Underrepresented physicians are more likely to practice in underserved areas, caring for patients in their own ethnic groups who are uninsured, on Medicaids, in a poor overall health, and thereby impacting health outcomes for these populations. Also, it's important to note that physician-patient race concordance has been shown to have a positive effect on patient satisfaction. It also helps with patient comprehensions, the use of preventative care, continuity of care, and many, many more aspects that really helps with this divide that is existing right now. Racial and ethnic diversity has also been shown to improve cultural competence of all doctors. And so with the increased attention on recruitment of URM students to medical schools to decrease this racial healthcare disparities, it's really troubling that the number of Black men, for instance, the matriculate has remained relatively constant over the past 30 years, even though the actual number of positions have actually increased. And so despite small gains, underrepresented medicine still continue to experience this disparity in terms of their proportion to that of the US population. Another study estimated that it would take 54 years for Latinx physicians to achieve a comparable representation to the US population. And so therefore, the understanding of these systemic barriers to success for underrepresented people in medicine is really imperative for us to enact change. And part of that, perhaps instead of looking at it as a pipeline that is leaky, we can look at it as pathways with several entry points. And so tonight we're going to be covering the evidence of the impact of bias in medical education to help explain this leaky pipeline.
Thanks, Dr. Alvarez, for that lead-in. My name is Cassandra Bradby. I am from East Carolina University, and I'm speaking tonight with the help of Dr. Wendy Sun, who couldn't be with us. Dr. Jessica Smith and I will be discussing biases that occur at the medical school level. We were inspired by the Armed Med Ed talk that Dr. Dowen Boatwright gave this year and is linked below, entitled The State of Diversity in Medical Education Today. And so in a similar way, we want to highlight biases that exist in the way that medical students are perceived, valued, and treated. In terms of how medical students are perceived, biases have been found in both clerkship evaluations and the medical student performance evaluations, also known as the Dean's Letter. In a study published by Dr. Rojek and his team, the authors noted from evaluating almost 90,000 clerkship evaluations that women received more personal attribute traits such as lovely and poised, while men received more competency-related traits such as scientific and relevant. Looking at the chart on the right side of the screen with words such as describing words for URM and non-URM medical students. As a whole, URM medical students have fewer descriptive words in evaluations, which you see in green, and most of them are, again, personal attribute-related words such as pleasant and Spanish, instead of competency-related words like thorough and knowledgeable. Next slide. Now, looking at the MSPE, or the Medical Student Performance Evaluations, in a study done by Dr. Ross and his team at Yale that looked at 6,000 MSPEs from graduates of 134 medical schools from 16 residency programs at Yale in the 2014-2015 application season, they found that white applicants were more likely to be described using standout or ability words, including exceptional, best, and outstanding, while Black applicants were more likely to be described as competent. These differences remained significant after controlling even for USMLE Step 1 scores. Next slide. Now, moving on to how medical students are valued. A lot of times this is done through award recognition, one of them being the Alpha Omega Alpha Honor Society. Biases in awards such as this one puts medical students at a disadvantage by hindering their future success, especially when the award is highly coveted, such as this one. For the AOA award, Dr. Boatwright and his team noted that racial disparities exist even after for controlling for USMLE Step 1, research productivity, community service, leadership activity, and Gold Humanism Honor Society membership. Black medical students had odds that were 80% less than their white peers to receive the award. Of note, the other statistically significant group were Asians, who were 50% less likely than their white peers to receive this award. Now I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Smith, who's going to talk about biases of how our medical students are treated.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to first talk about microaggressions. The first thing we can do is define them. So microaggressions, by definition, are subtle, nonverbal debasement of any minor group. They can be intentional or non-intentional. Some examples that we may unfortunately be familiar with are things like, you don't look like you speak Spanish, or no, where are you really from? You're not like the other Black people I know, you speak so well. Via Dr. Boatwright's survey and his presentation, the most common themes that were reported by medical students in terms of microaggressions were: number one, people are surprised by how well I speak English. Number two, people imply I was admitted to medical school for reasons other than academic merit. Three, some people's ideas are ignored while others are applauded when they say the same thing because of their race, gender, or identity. Or four, because of my gender, my expertise and my experience is often under-recognized. Specifically, in order of the frequency of microaggressions, about 60% of students reported microaggressions in terms of their gender, similarly 60% in terms of race, 35% in terms of age and ancestry, followed by things like skin color, socioeconomic status, height, weight, and religion. If we go to the next slide, we have a couple of graphs here, which demonstrate the microaggressions and their impact on medical student education. In the top figure, you can see that greater than 25% of medical students experience microaggressions at least daily. And this was just about as common as if they experience them at least once weekly or even monthly. Only about 2% of the students stated they never experienced a microaggression. So clearly this is a problem that affects everyone. What we see in the second figure here is that there's a clear dose-dependent relationship between microaggressions and medical student wellness. More microaggressions, simply put, means the student was more likely to screen positive for depression. Not pictured here, but also studied, were similar results for students in terms of their satisfaction with their medical school. Those who experienced daily or weekly microaggressions were less likely to recommend their medical school. They were less likely to stay there for residency or even donate to their program after the completion of training. And even more worrisome, they considered missing class or withdrawing from medical school at a much higher rate than their peers who experienced less frequent microaggressions. So all of this to say is that we really need to continue the education in the medical education realm to reduce the occurrence of these biases, because clearly they impact our medical students. Now I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Jarman to talk to us about bias at the residency level.
Great, thank you all. I'm Dr. Angela Jarman. I'm an assistant professor at UC Davis and the director of sex and gender there. So you're going to definitely get a flavor for that as we talk about some data at the residency level. Let's go to the next slide. So just to back up for a moment, we're talking here about bias and about equity. So what is equity? You can click next. So we're talking about the quality of being fair and impartial, and essentially the freedom from bias or favoritism. So as you can see, the case has been set up by Dr. Alvarez and Dr. Bradby, that we have two problems here. We have a representation problem in terms of numbers with lack of URM candidates and lack of women as well, particularly in the higher ranks. But we also are having a different experience for these providers, as you heard, in terms of microaggression. So what we're seeking here is not necessarily equality, which you see on the left here, but equity, where everybody gets the same experience, the same opportunities, et cetera. Next slide. I also just want to acknowledge the idea of intersectionality next. the definition of which you'll see here, which is the complex cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination combine, overlap, and intersect. So that's a really important concept here. And although I'm going to talk mostly about gender-based discrimination, that's because that's my particular area of expertise and because that's where we have the most data, but I don't want to take anything away from all of our other types of identities, and particularly minoritized identities. Next slide. Which is depicted here. And this is just to show that any number of your identities can be in a privileged or an oppressed position. And where you fall on those spectra depend on time, depend on location, on the culture that you're in. So this is kind of a classic one you'll see here, like white, cisgendered, able-bodied man, right? As sort of at the highest place in our society. So think about that as we go through in ways in which these multiple identities could affect one. Next. So we're going to talk a little bit about stereotypical gendered behavior. This slide and the one after I've actually borrowed from Dr. Nick Gorton, so I want to certainly give him credit for these. But essentially, look here, this is what we consider sort of traditional feminine traits. A woman who is kind, helpful, sympathetic, nurturing, dedicated to her family, right? So these are service or community oriented traits that we classically map to woman. And then next, we'll compare those to the traditionally masculine traits. These are commonly termed agentic traits, in which the man is aggressive and tough and independent, very decisive, and very dedicated to work versus dedicated to family. Next. So if we think about how those map in terms of stereotypical gendered qualities, of course, we have pink here for the feminine traits and blue for the stereotypically masculine traits. I want everybody to just think about our job and what we do and what characteristics make for a good emergency medicine doctor and where do they fit? Next. And you can go ahead and one more over this. So this is a paper. I've given you sort of the title here if anybody wants to look these up, but here's looking at the professional background. So that meant MD versus advanced practice provider and residents' perceptions of them leading a code, essentially. So this was a study in which the study team hired an actor, scripted a scenario, and then reran it several times. They ran it with a woman and with a man and someone who was wearing a doctor badge, and then I believe it was a nurse practitioner. This is table one for the paper that I only put up here because I work at UC Davis and Dr. Alvarez works at Stanford. And so this is who is included in the study, and these are our people, okay? They included emergency medicine residents at these California programs. And let's look at the results next. And if you'll give me one more so I can highlight what's important here. And again, forgive me, I'm trying to be a researcher, or I am a researcher, and so I really like data, but I'll draw your eyes to what is important to look at here. So this study, the outcome they measured was the Ottawa CRS score, which was a crisis resource management scale. But the important thing here is that to note that for every domain, which is what you see in the columns, men were ranked higher. So it mattered much more what your presenting gender was than it did even if you were a physician or an advanced practice provider. The two domains that I've highlighted here, which are leadership and communication, are the two in which these differences were statistically significant. But essentially, if you look across for male compared to female, the men were rated higher than the women. And again, these were actors who had, everything was micromanaged, including mannerisms and body language. Next. What about qualitative data? What can we learn there? So this and the previous study were both published in academic medicine. So great journals. Next, this is a qualitative study in which they actually interviewed internal medicine residents, but kind of talked to them about what is the ideal code leader. And male and female residents agreed on what it meant to be a good code leader. They identified this as someone who had an authoritative, strong presence, who spoke with a loud and deep voice, used direct communication, and exhibited muted emotions or emotional control. So again, I'll ask you to imagine those agentic versus communal traits and think about which those kind of map onto. This is a great quote. Anyone who tells you that being a white male with a deep voice who's a little bit taller is not at an advantage to be perceived positively or perceived as in control would be lying in really any situation, not just a code. So this just kind of goes to show that the traditional masculine behaviors have a significant overlap with the behaviors that we consider effective in running a code. Next. And the women that they interviewed here noted that they were capable of running the codes, but they had a significant perceived stress from violating their gender norms in the sense that they had to engage in agentic behaviors and suffered some sort of stress from having to do that. A lot of them felt the need to apologize afterward when they had acted in a way that was traditionally masculine. Next. And one more, please. This is just the devil's advocate. I like to plant my own devil's advocates in case anybody was tempted to suggest that perhaps men were better at running codes. This is a SIM study that just shows that the performance, objective performance, was equal between the genders. Next, please. And now we're going to move into talking about emergency medicine residents specifically. So this was a pretty big paper. A lot of you probably are familiar with it, which looked at resident milestone evaluations a few years ago. Next slide. So again, and I apologize because it's busy, but I'll point you in the right direction. So the first few columns here are PGY1. So when residents come in, and what's important is the difference column. So this is literally a difference between the scores of male and female or women and men residents. And if you'll notice that those differences are really negligible. They all hover around 0. They might be slightly negative or slightly positive, but effectively the residents were ranked the same. Fast forward to the PGY3 year, and you'll notice if you look at that difference column, there are significant differences there. And a negative value here indicates that men were ranked higher than women. So what is that about? Next slide. The next is a graphical representation of that same thing, essentially showing that the women and men were ranked right together when they were interns. But by PGY3 year, you see those two separate peaks in which men are actually ranked significantly higher on the milestone score. Next. And the amount that they were ranked higher in milestones actually equates to several months of training, 0.15 milestones. So it begs the question, are we failing our trainees, or is gender bias at play here? And again, I just want to emphasize, similar to the study that Dr. Bradby quoted, this was a huge paper. It had 33,000 evaluations, 8 hospitals, multiple ACGME accredited residency programs. And interestingly, they also found that the gender of the evaluator, the gender of the attending did not matter in this case. Next slide. Following that quantitative paper, the same authors undertook a qualitative paper in which they looked at the narrative evaluations that residents received. And again, they found that it was easy to define what is the ideal emergency medicine resident. You'll see over there on the left side, everything that's in red is a characteristic that we traditionally equate with masculine behavior or agentic behavior. Next slide. You can keep going. And so what essentially was important in this study is they found that men received consistent messages about how they needed to perform better. You can keep next. Whereas women received conflicting information when they were struggling. Next. So this is a great example. We're going to discuss Emma, who is one resident. So she received this evaluation. I would encourage Emma to be more assertive. During critical resuscitations, she should let those working around her know she is the team leader. Okay, so we think maybe she needs some more confidence. But then the next evaluation says Emma's progressing well. She's very thoughtful, reliable. She has appropriate confidence and autonomy. And lastly, same resident, same point in time, Emma argues a lot with the attending. She's very confident in her diagnosis and has a hard time entertaining other possibilities. So that leaves, paints the picture here. What in the world is Emma to think about her performance? Next slide. And again, same study, they just shows that they had a lot more comments on personality traits for men than women. And this is similar to the UME world that was discussed as well, where men are much more likely to have all positive feedback about their personality, which begs the question, is this goodness of fit model with agentic traits really, really something that impacts your job as an emergency medicine physician. Next slide, please. Couple more examples and then we'll move on. So there's a great book called The Confidence Gap that's not specific to medicine. It talks about gendered behavior, and in general, men are socialized or tend to actually be overconfident, and there are some good studies that they tend to overestimate their performance in terms of medical residency. But this is a great example from the Hewlett-Packard Company, in which they found that men were very happy to apply for a job if they had met 60% of their requirements, whereas women would not dare until they had met every single requirement that was listed. Next slide. Just a little bit of evidence on why diverse teams are better. I hope that one of the takeaways you get from our talk tonight is that we believe in diversity of all forms. Two more, Dr. Alvarez. So diverse teams focus more on facts. They process these facts more carefully due to the divergent points of view, and they're more innovative. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, in a previous iteration, there may have been another slide, but the other last point I wanted to make here is that from the business world, diverse teams actually make more money. So they improve the bottom line as well. So I just want to throw that in there so that we know, medicine is not the only world that struggles with diversity, and more evidence that diverse teams bring great value to our patients. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jarman. So I'd like to start by expressing my thanks for the chance to delve deeply into this topic, to consider what matters and to work toward clear communication on these important issues. And also like to thank all the participants for their engagement on this topic. So I'm discussing bias at the faculty level, which is really a summary of all the mechanisms perpetuating bias during a career in emergency medicine after residency graduation. I'll also focus disproportionately on gender examples, as Dr. Jarman mentioned, but certainly the principles that she described with intersectionality are clearly in force here as well and apply to underrepresented groups of all types. So bias can affect careers from the first day on the job through retirement. And I'd like to just review some of the data on disparities in each of these areas that faculty may experience. So starting with hiring, women and underrepresented minorities are not being hired in academic emergency medicine at expected rates. Women comprise half of all medical students, but the number of female academic emergency physicians remains at approximately 30% and has been stagnant at that level for at least a decade, where other medical subspecialties like surgery are making progress along those lines. So academic emergency medicine has work to do in the hiring department. Regarding evaluations, female faculty receive poor teaching evaluations from students in comparison to their male counterparts, and that extends across specialties in medicine, unfortunately. Awards, women disproportionately receive early career awards versus only about 10% of late career or named awards, and interestingly, none of which are named for women. Titles and roles. There's less published data on this, but I'd ask you to think about your department. Who's the chair, the vice chair, the director of EMS, the research director, and who has titles with outside funding? Who has grant funding? And then think about who are the assistant program directors, the folks who lead diversity, equity, and inclusion, who coordinates the education curriculum, who leads wellness initiatives. And just consider those two groups. Then think about whether you know which titles and roles are paid in your department or how much they're paid, who has time allotted to speak at faculty meetings or other meetings. Just being aware of some of these issues gives you power to enact change and to be an ally. Next, promotion. So there were no women or underrepresented minorities, deans or chairs in emergency medicine in 1991. Today, it's less than 20%. So that's pretty slow progress. 2019 ACGME data show that 12.7% of department chairs are women. So really nowhere close to equity there. Salary, even after adjusting for a comprehensive list of variables, including race, region, rank, years of experience, clinical hours, core faculty status, administrative roles, board certification, and fellowship training, the mean salary for women in academic emergency medicine is $19,418 less than men. And women of color in other data show that they may earn less than 29% than their male counterparts. That's in more of for various medical specialties and not necessarily specific to EM. Moving on, microaggressions were mentioned previously, but the data on that among faculty physicians in emergency medicine is also disturbing. Not only do women get paid less for the work, but the job experience is likely more difficult, with microaggressions disproportionately experienced by women and people of color. With higher rates of burnout and attrition, emergency medicine also has more than double the rate of gender-based harassment of women. So that's 45% versus 20% in other, that's the medical average is 20%. Female physicians also face twice the risk of suicide as their male colleagues. Yet despite all this, when we look at patient outcomes, women outperform men. Patients treated by women had lower mortality and lower 30-day readmission rates. So again, medicine is just proving what's already been concluded in so many other fields and what Dr. Jarman mentioned, that increasing diversity increases performance, economic productivity, creativity, and even here improves patient survival. So I'd like to move on. Given all these many ways that women and underrepresented minorities in medicine encounter bias at every phase of their career, what can we do to combat this? Because it gets pretty heavy to think about this stuff for however many minutes we are into this. And so I'd like to kind of talk about some ideas to make a difference and change the future. So I kind of collapse this into three overall best practices, and I'd like to explore one each individually. So first, acknowledging that historical bias exists. Next slide. So it's important to promote awareness of bias, but not acceptance. And I think there are two parts to that. First, encouraging everyone to take ownership of their individual implicit bias and making it common knowledge that when you're feeling stressed or rushed, stereotyped decisions rooted in implicit bias are much more likely. And it's the individual's responsibility to understand this and guard against this. Also important to identify systemic bias. Look for patterns, ask hard questions about diversity in your departments, amplify the voices of those who are underrepresented and maybe facing systemic biases that you don't see. Talk about all the isms and allow those issues to be addressed, because adopting an attitude of I don't see color or that type of take basically shuts down productive conversation and promotes those stereotype decisions that we want to avoid. Part of this is also to just vouch for underrepresented minorities and women in medicine. And part of that includes paying them for their work, especially in DEI and avoiding minority tax issues. Transparency can be painful, but it's worthwhile. So it's really important to publish the cringeworthy data breakdown on race or gender in your department, whether that's on salaries, awards, publications, and avoid any hidden agendas along those lines. By openly acknowledging the benefits of diversity, hopefully we can, acknowledge and be transparent as possible. Lastly, you can help call out the benefit of diversity openly and routinely by being frank about the historical record of bias, especially prior to all important decisions about hiring, promotions, or award decisions. I think the only risk that's worth highlighting here is that if you do this often enough, it could be normalized or accepted somehow that bias is okay. And you want to make sure to clearly oppose that interpretation of this historical awareness. Next slide. So next, choosing methods that reduce bias. First, clearly define award and promotion criteria, as well as hiring criteria. So really making an effort in enunciating what those things are before you even start talking makes a big difference about making people do the work and reflect and not use stereotype decisions when they're making those choices. Make sure that these criteria that you come up with are free of gendered words. As we discussed previously, there's some kind of gender background to a lot of the common language we use, and you should make a specific effort to avoid those. Eliminate requirements for eligibility unless those are truly needed. Seek a diverse selection committee. Create individual shortlists of your finalists before comparing notes. That way, that helps ensure all voices are heard. Use blinding. Encourage creative ideas for rating scales or any other non-traditional selection methods. So do anything you can basically to keep this process fresh. The more boring and traditional methodologies you use, the more stereotypical responses you're more likely to get, and they're more likely to be biased. Next slide. So lastly, I think this is really important. Holding decision makers accountable for rigorous, thoughtful analysis is key to reducing bias. So making award and hiring and promotion decisions easy actually makes it more prone to bias. I think that's something that we kind of have to guard against because we always want to make it easier for our colleagues to do their job. But in this case, it actually is probably not beneficial. Additionally, don't do any work that's important about hiring or awards or promotion when hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. So HALT, that's the mnemonic for that. If participants select the criteria that they think are most important prior to considering the candidates, they're more likely to avoid those stereotypical biased responses. Implement use of any templates or rubrics that promote objective analysis and highlight work that otherwise might not be appreciated. So making the invisible work visible when you're making those decisions. And lastly, requiring justification of the final choice with supporting specific reasons for that choice may help place a check on any stereotyped or biased decisions. I think next up is Dr. Lall to talk about how she's implemented some of these things.
That's right. So far we've gone from really highlighting different areas of bias in medical education, from undergraduate medical education to residency training to faculty. And you can really throw a dart and hopefully hit somewhere that you can affect some changes. And so now Dr. Lall is going to talk about doing this from a letters of recommendation perspective.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Alvarez. I am Michelle Lall, and I'm an associate professor at Emory. I am also our director of Wellbeing, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, also known as the WEDI, which is everybody's preferred term for my position. Next slide, please. So I want to give everyone a little bit of a chance to kind of take a look at this letter of recommendation. This is mine. I wrote this several years ago about a male student. And then we're going to compare one of my letters that I wrote about a female student. And I recognize that I continue to have growth in this area. We all write letters of recommendation. And sometimes it is really hard to know if you have inherent bias or not. So Dr. Alvarez put a link in there for some group work where you can take a closer look at these letters. And we'll give everyone just a minute or so. And if people want to highlight some things that they see as more of those agentic traits that I highlighted for this student, please feel free to put it in the chat or speak up.
I see people are highlighting driven.
All right. So yes, I think driven is one of those words. We do have natural team player, which kind of implies that any man should be naturally a team player, whereas a woman might not. What else? Anyone else want to highlight any other words that they see there? All right. Anyone want to share what type of student you think this was? Outstanding, excellent. I know I used excellent a lot in this letter. Good, average. What do you think?
Top 10.
Top 10. Man, and you know,
Honors.
honors. So I do believe this student received honors. He's from quite a while ago. But honestly, he was maybe above average, but this is a pretty glowing letter. Now, I will admit there's probably some bias because he was a medical student from the institution I work in, right? And we're all a little biased to our own students. We want them to succeed and do well. So maybe there was a bit of that playing into it as well. All right, next slide, please, Dr. Alvarez. All right, so this is an ESLO for a female student. And again, I'll give you guys the opportunity to kind of take a look through some of this. And man, in hindsight, I am really embarrassed by my word choice on some of these things, but we all learn and grow. So this is, I think, another opportunity to see where perhaps my language, while I thought was, at the time really being complimentary to the student, actually did a disservice because it was biased.
I just want to take this moment to really acknowledge Dr. Lall for putting herself out there for us to kind of watch a letter, like a couple of letters that she's written. Like each and every one of us have been put in this situation or will be put in this situation. And you kind of showing this to us really gives us an idea of, especially for somebody who you have a direct role on this, and yet bias still happens. And I can only imagine for those of us who do not, how much more common that is. I also want to comment on the fact that people are very quick to actually start writing stuff on the second letter as opposed to the first one. So I don't know what that means, what that says, but like everybody looked at like a good letter and like, all right, well, maybe if we nitpick, we can focus on agentic like words. But very quickly, people looked at the second letter and then started typing about different other ways that they can change it.
All right. So, I mean, right, I have bright, caring, compassionate, geez. Right. I look at this and in hindsight, I certainly could have chosen better adjectives to describe this student. What do you guys think? And this is a little bit of an abbreviated version of her letter, but where would you rank her? Any thoughts? Top third. Yeah, she was definitely top third, and I think right on our cusp of that top 10. So she was an outstanding student. And I think in hindsight, right, I would have used some different language. But this is all a learning experience. And I will say that something has helped me is I have a letter writing buddy who kind of does a double check for me on all my letters, just to make sure that I haven't used language that might be biased, or even things that feel like very positive adjectives that may still be inherently biased. Next slide. So I'm sure some of you have seen this before. This comes from the University of Arizona, but this is a list of adjectives to avoid and a list of adjectives to include. I actually have this now printed out right on my bulletin board by my office computer so that I can double check myself too in my word choice. Next slide. All right.
Thank you again. So now we have Q&A. I can imagine there's several faculty here in the medical educator positions and also some students and trainees. This is a good time to ask questions. There's a lot of experts here, specifically in this realm. And Dr. Mannix asked about resources and links. We will post that where SAM is going to be posting this. So that's a great suggestion. Any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself or just ask, or if you want, you can type that as well.
So for those that are looking for some extra help with your letters, there's actually a gender bias calculator out of the UK. You can actually cut and paste your letter recommendation into this calculator, and it will tell you if your verbiage is more gendered in either direction, which I found to be interesting.
Hi, this is Rochelle Cooper. I was going to ask a question because I'm old and I see some of these things and I think it's all really important. I sort of watch sort of how stuff has changed, and I sort of think we sort of use the, you use an agentic word. We use words that describe men are considered acceptable, and the words that are considered men are considered biased and unacceptable. But I sort of think, like, if someone was writing a letter about me or talking about me and they didn't say she's an incredibly empathetic physician, I would be insulted. I feel like it's an important sort of thing. And I also think it's something that some residents struggle with, men and women, like connecting with people and other sort of things that are really important to the job that we do. And to say that is not to say that I'm not saying that this person, man or woman, I would say it about both people, really, that they're not intelligent or internally, my sort of thing is, are they internally driven and self-motivated? They want to be great because they want to be great. That's not about these other things, the things that I think are important. And I think, as I've gone through sort of my career and some of the things and some of the steps and accomplishments I've had, where people sort of say, like, I do things differently. That doesn't mean that it's wrong. I may not do it the way the men do it. And I think that's okay. I think that's what we want in the diversity, but we're kind of told to write it like a man, do this like a man, talk about these people like there's not something, and that's the right way to do it. And is that the right thing? Are these words bad, or is it how we interpret them, or who's judging it? That's the problem.
I would just add that I think part of the goal or the purpose is to destabilize that, like you're saying, say that, I might consider that I'm an excellent physician because I can wear both of these hats, right? Like, I can be empathetic, I can be nurturing, and I am an excellent communicator, but I can also run a code effectively. And so that's part of the progress that we're trying to make, is not to say that feminine characteristics are bad and that masculine characteristics are good, but using that lens can help us, I think, understand some of the bias and sort of the punishment for when you don't comply with gender norms, if that makes sense. But I totally hear you that I think a lot of the traditional feminine traits actually make for excellent an excellent physician. And certainly for me, that's one of the goals, is to try to get that across. Yet we have to recognize that we live in this sort of society that expects us to behave a different way, and that we may be punished when we operate outside of that. So that's sort of what we're trying to do. And I don't want the implication to be that any of those words are bad, but what's bad, I would say, is when they are at the exclusion of saying this person is incredibly intelligent, incisive, great decision maker. We don't want to just hear that she's nice and friendly and empathetic, right? We need to hear sort of that is good, but we need to hear the other part as well.
And I think it's great to acknowledge all of those things that you mentioned, maybe when working on a shift with female or other underrepresented people in medicine. But perhaps when you're making the award criteria, being aware of the implicit bias that using certain words might yield in your award recipients, or when you're writing a letter, how that might be interpreted is just important to be aware of.
I think Dr. Lall also was gonna say something.
Yeah, no, I think, Rochelle, you make fantastic points. And I agree with you. And I think just to highlight, I'm in a Facebook group of women physicians, and somebody posted a part of a letter that a PD had written, and it described the woman as a nose to the grindstone, put your head down, get the work done person. And I think all of us who are probably 40 and older see that as complimentary, right? This is a no nonsense, get it done, incredibly hardworking resident. Whereas many of those who were a bit younger found it to be highly offensive to suggest that a woman in medicine should just put her head down and get the job done. They interpreted that to really mean that, she won't cause any trouble, she'll do what she's told. And I found the whole discussion on the thread super interesting, because it really is about the perception of the reader. And I think that's, to Angela's point, what we're really hoping is that the language we use really only has one perception, and hopefully it's in a positive light.
I will also add that I really like what Dr. Lall said earlier about having like a letter writer buddy. In our clerkship, we designed this a few years ago now, so that yes, we acknowledge that letter writers will have, especially in the slow, people will write down agentic comments. Some people also write down things like compassion and all those things. While they're important, I think it's much more important to have a balance. Like, you need to have a balanced agentic descriptors to the other, like social, compassionate, like soft, like descriptors that we tend to use more traditionally with women. I think balancing that is very helpful, so that yes, when you evaluate men, for instance, you can comment that they're not as compassionate, they're not, so all the other things that they may not have, as opposed to just highlighting all of the agentic comments. The next person that has a question is Dr. Mall, Brittany Mall.
Hi guys, I just had a question about how you guys have implemented change as it concerns like gender bias and minorities in medicine within your respective departments. Because when we do rank lists, when you review these letters, it's not just individuals, right? It's a group of people and everybody has different perspectives. And the people who are on the call now are very interested in it, but some of the other people within our various departments may not be as in tune with what bias is, or devote as much energy to it. So I just want to know what you guys have done to educate your colleagues or promote education of bias within your departments, and kind of how that went.
So I think having the conversation is actually the best place to start. So if you never talk about it in the first place, like, I'll be honest, it's not going to occur to a lot of people to even talk about it at all. We actually had a CME garnering like grand rounds talk for all of GME regarding this topic, particularly bias in evaluations, since all of us as GME professionals are required to evaluate someone for something, and also interpret those things and turn them into the fun known as milestones. How do you write a grade evaluation? How are you supposed to take that? How can you give feedback to someone on their evaluation? So we talked about a lot of those things, like as a GME as a whole. We are also trying to talk about more of those things in faculty meetings. So in your department alone, you have faculty meeting probably every month or so. And that's another great place to highlight those things in small ways, because you don't want to give a whole lecture in the middle of faculty meeting, right? So it might be a better idea saying, hey, we've reviewed a bunch of evaluations recently. We noticed these themes. We noticed improvement in name your thing here. And I think that goes over a lot better. And it also like repeats the thought process and raising awareness of it, so that when people are writing their evaluations later, it dawns on them.
I would just add, Brittany, I think obviously it depends on the institutional culture too, but having buy-in from the top is super helpful. So in my department, our chair is super involved. And so when he passes down, when he tells other people this is important, they hear him probably a lot more than they hear me when I say that this is important. But even if you're in a place where you're not getting that from the top, it's helpful to kind of organize yourself, and you can work from the ground up. So you've probably heard of the meeting before the meeting. I use that strategy when I sort of, I don't want to say I have an agenda, but I know that my values or my priorities may differ from whoever's in charge of the committee, hiring, et cetera, right? But when you have some like-minded people, you guys can kind of organize before the meeting so that the leaders are hearing it from multiple people. It's easier for them to hear, and then using those tools like amplifying. If I say something, then you could come after me and say, yeah, that's an important point that Dr. Jarman made, to try to sort of organize yourselves and get buy-in from folks.
Yeah, and another example is having these conversations with your either DEI committee. So if you have that, I think that's a nice safe space to start the conversation, so that eventually it can be discussed beyond those the groups in the DEI committee. At least you know that in that group, people are going to be much more willing to listen, and then have the strategy that you can develop. Like, how can we then address this outside for the rest of the department? So I'll give you an example. Just last week, as we were finishing with the holistic review for the residency, a question was asked about research potential versus the number of publications, because we can imagine that the minority tax of having to do being part of different committees, leadership roles, community service, in addition to, especially if you're coming from a lower socioeconomic background, may not afford you to have the time to do research. And so, which means that you may not have the number of publication that other students may have. And so how can we then assess that? And so it was a nice conversation amongst faculty from different levels to just understand, like, this is something that we need to look into if we're truly going to do holistic review and include research as a domain. And so I think that's one way to start the conversation, as opposed to simply like just ignoring it, which is probably one of the worst things, or making a decision, like a unilateral decision, without involving everybody else, and then they find out later on that they don't agree with that answer. I'm also going to ask Dr. Smith, like, as a resident, I wonder, like, what are tangible things that you have seen like residents do that can make an impact in this aspect?
I think there's so many things you can still do as a resident. I mean, we may be residents, but I think we are future letter writers and interviewees and department chairs and things like that. So just even starting to raise awareness, to learn about it, and to talk about it with your peers, whether that's like through conference, as like a didactic session, whether that's attending things like this, whether that's, you know, paying attention to how you write your feedback for medical students that you're supervising on shift, or even peer feedback to your co-residents. I think it just starts with, you know, making sure that this is integrated into our education now, so that whenever we get to the point where we have a little more influence and have the opportunity to apply these principles, that we're simply aware of them.
Thank you. There was a question in the chat about often in these DEI committees, they're mostly underrepresented in medicine individuals as well. So how do we overcome this minority tax?
So on our diversity committee at Emory, we actually have somebody who is assigned to be the leader of our ally group. And he's a white man in his mid to late 40s. And often he will be the first to bring some of these agenda items up at larger meetings, at faculty meetings, meetings with higher level leadership. And then he will continue to work to amplify the rest of us when we speak. And we have found it to be highly successful. And he and the others who do it with him, like, they really feel like they are making a difference. So I think we also have to be mindful to remember our allies and that we have them out there and that we need to engage them. I think they just need a little direction in how they can do that in the most advantageous way. So.
And I just reiterate that sometimes having an ally at the top of the leadership chain can make a huge difference in making some of these discussions be the norm before every hiring decision, before every award decision, whatever, just changing the culture so that, considering this is part of every one of those decisions.
And I would say, pay him, pay her, right? If this is work that is valued, then it needs to be valued, if that makes sense. So if you're going to ask people to serve in this capacity in service, then that needs to be worth something for them. So whether that's buy down, whether that's a title, whatever that means, the minority tax is when we ask people to do stuff for free, and fixing sexism in medicine is not my job, just like fixing racism in medicine is not the job of people of color. It's all of our job.
I love it. There's another suggestion is to have all faculty members participate in department committees and rotate every few years. Having the chair have the expectation helps. And we do that with our administrative committees and residency committees such as the CCC. Yes, and I think so. An example, for instance, at our shop, it's part of our incentive compensation. And so every year we are asked, like, what have you done to advance diversity and inclusion in our departments? And now they're even including that as part of the promotion packets for the School of Medicine. So you can make an impact beyond just giving people titles. And also, if you're involving them, include them in the publication. If you're researching this, like, make sure you give them due credit in that work. As we're ending up, so I really love the conversation here. We're going to leave you some take-home points. Dr. Smith, you want to start us off? Oh, you're muted.
Oh, sorry, thanks. Yeah, so thank you so much for joining us today. I think our first take-home point is to just be aware of micro biases that may exist, how we can influence them, how we can prevent them, and just know that they do impact our medical students and that they're very important. Yeah, just be aware.
Dr. Binstadt.
So my take home would just be remembering that making decisions easy isn't always the goal. Sometimes making it hard, acknowledging that it's hard and doing the work is the goal, and acknowledging that there's a history of bias is not a bad thing as long as you're working towards a better future.
Dr. Bradby.
I think for the most part, just keeping in mind what you're actually trying to say and what is actually being said. And because sometimes I think we get a little twisted in what comes out of our mouths or out of our fingers versus what we were actually trying to say. So playing it back to make sure that it says what you think it says.
Dr. Jarman.
My take home would just be that bias is everywhere. And so one of the best things you can do is just accept that and work on mitigating it. I always tell people that when I take the IAT, I have a strong association of male with science, and that boggles my mind and makes me very upset every time. But I grew up in a society, and therefore I have these associations, and that doesn't make me a bad person, but it makes it important what I do with that information. So don't feel bad about having bias. It's a function of being human, but work on combating any negative biases you have.
Thank you. Dr. Lall.
Find a buddy, somebody who, is willing to call you out on your bias when they see it, because as Angela just said, it's everywhere. We all have it. And I think just continue the good work, continue to be allies. And if you need to stop and think, it's okay to stop and think before you speak, type, or anything else, but just keep up the good work because we have to do it together.
And I'll just say that clearly, as you've learned today or tonight, in every aspect of medical education, bias exists. And so we can all play our part in making a positive difference here. And so with that, we're going to end you with a call to action. We're going to ask you to text yourself. What's one thing that you would do to minimize bias in medical education. This way, it sticks better for you. I just want to take this opportunity again to really thank you. Thanks to the presenters here with me here. These are experts. They've donated their time to really be here. So thank you so much. And thank you also for the participants in the audience, including those in the live stream of this. Really, thank you so much. Thanks to SAM, and I hope each of you have a great night.